how do we begin to make markets work better? Because all of the work that we're doing, all of these things, it would be kind of irrelevant if the market worked properly. We would get where we need to go. And so we need to be pushing on that market, changing that market, rethinking things, because if it were simply that invisible hand, then we would get to a solution that was more desirable without all of this extra work. And yet that's clearly not the world we live in. It's eminently obvious.
Climate change. We've never faced a greater threat. Yet all that we produce and consume inflates the debt of greenhouse gases we release. We feel them raise the temp, and the tempest we'll unleash will leave us weeping to forget, unless we take collective action, make a pledge to finally change our ways and keep climate change in check, to benefit the planet and all of its inhabitants. We know it can be done, so listen up and join the quest.
And climate change demands that we change everything that we do. Chad's Climate Quest is brought to you by Regen Intel, activating humanity to become a planet-positive species. Find out more at www.regenintel.earth. On today's episode, we are welcoming David Carlin. He brings a wealth of experience, having collaborated with over 100 financial institutions on climate scenarios, risk assessments, and sustainability regulation. He's on the front line of finance for the benefit of the planet, crafting best practices and environmental opportunities and understanding the risk of inaction, while actively contributing to pivotal initiatives like the Task Force on Nature-Related Finance Disclosures and the Net Zero Banking Alliance. He also boasts a highly active social media presence with 100,000 followers eagerly awaiting his next insightful posts. Hi, David. It's great to have you on the show. Thank you for coming along my climate quest.
Thanks so much, Chad. It's great to be here and have really admired the work that you've done over many years of developing solutions and exploring how we can really get to that regenerative and sustainable future that you were just talking about in the intro.
Thank you, David. It's so great to have you here. One of my favorite people. I've had so many conversations that have been super insightful. I mean, we remember the last time we chatted, we had scheduled 30 minutes. I think we ended up talking for 2 hours. So I'm really excited to have you on the show. But one of the things I want to start with, little tongue in cheek, but I'm a language nerd. I'm a data nerd, just like you. And so I got to ask, how did a policy and finance wonk from the UN become a LinkedIn influencer? I mean, I'm joking. I know I love your content. It's refreshingly technical and straightforward and engaging, and I love it. How has it been becoming a top voice on climate and sustainability?
So it's a funny thing, because I would always say that I've aged out of most of the social media. I don't have a TikTok. I don't really understand Instagram. And suddenly, about a year and a half ago, people said, I really like what you're posting on LinkedIn. And in some ways, what I had been sharing there was really just a distillation of things that I had been reading and learning about that I found interesting. And in some ways, I think that as much as the pieces I'm putting together are trying to make it simpler for people to understand, it's also been a community that I found of other people all around the world that are equally excited about the latest developments in climate tech, in climate policy, and in international negotiations related to climate change. So to me, there's such velocity of information. And so we learn from each other. And I've been lucky to be a voice that tries to communicate these things in a way that's both accessible and empowering, because I think there's so much noise out there. So if we can grab on to the substance that really benefits all of us, and I hope that my channel and my work is contributing to that.
I mean, I think you touched upon the right word, substance, right? I mean, you're one of the only folks on LinkedIn that I see can post a text-heavy chart that, I mean, you could open up this image and you see all of this text in a graph, in a chart, and you get like 500 likes. I love it because I actually appreciate that too. I mean, it's so different a viewpoint than a lot of the social media you see out there, even on LinkedIn, which doesn't always have that substance. And I just want to say I really appreciate that. I actually absorb that so much, to see the technical details, the graphs. And I know a lot of other people appreciate that in this sort of, light approach to social media. You really provide that substance. And so thank you for that work. I think your work at the United Nations is really clearly very important. But one of the things I really like to start with all of my guests is, can you share a little bit about your journey? Like what led you to become a leader in sustainable finance? And what were some of these like important key moments that shaped your path? What was your journey like?
So I've probably taken a fairly non-traditional path, but what's fun is as I speak to people and ask them this question, people that I meet, people I'm working with, there isn't really a traditional path here. And so I retract that in some ways to say that in the case of some of this work, one of the big pieces that I think is really critical with the UN and critical just in my journey is kind of what was the part that I had to hang on to. And I think that was really the financial sector. I had started my career not in a financial context, but rather in social sciences, behavioral economics, social psychology. And I had come into social science sort of because of my interest in people. And finance was a little bit of this new direction of what do people do with this information if they're not in a research institution. And so over several years of working in the financial sector, what I ended up doing was really getting to a place where I had developed a knowledge of the financial system, but I also had this outside interest in looking to create social impact. So I had run a volunteer organization for young people in New York to get them more socially engaged in the city. I had also been working on a number of other causes kind of as a skilled volunteer. And so when a project came up to work with the United Nations, I didn't know as much about climate change at the time as perhaps other issues like educational equity and many other social causes. But what I found was so much of what I had studied and so much of my own interests around science, around how people think, all of it really coalesced here within climate. And so I sometimes joke climate is the great hidden liberal art that you get to tell people, I'm an expert in climate. And they say, oh, so what do you cover? Well, I look at climate finance and climate science. And in any other field, we would say, oh, well, you're a financier, you're a scientist, you're a activist, you're a this and that. And climate, I think, because we need integrated solutions, because we need systems thinkers, it really brings all of that together. And I've always found that an incredibly rich way of looking at the world. I've been a writer kind of on nights and weekends on history and on social topics during my time in the financial sector on totally unrelated things. And so with climate, it's this perfect coalescence. We need all hands on deck, and it means that we need all skill sets. And so my evolution really came coming in from that financial angle, but I think awakening a lot of these other parts within me. And then just a real desire to learn. And what's incredible is you meet so many brilliant and wonderful people, and each one is bringing a new perspective, whether it's about a technology you didn't understand, about a study to recast your thinking. And so I always say, try to kind of get a little bit mentally perturbed, knocked about in your thinking each day. Think of something new. Yeah. And to me, that's part of getting back to the question about the LinkedIn page is things that really stimulate me. I try to share, and I think that they've caught on with others who find that both stimulating and then also useful in thinking about it in their work.
Yeah, and I think that's that interdisciplinary approach, cross geographies, cross generations, climate change, because as we say, affects everything else. I mean, it's a multiplier effect on the challenges that we're facing across all issue areas. And yet it's also this space where we have solutions across all of these areas. And so we need to bring in, the social scientists, the economists, the physical scientists, the natural science, the engineers, the politicians, everyone has a role to play when something is so universal and it impacts every person on this planet, like climate change. And this is part of that notion of it being, a great opportunity, the great opportunity to design something that can be so transformative because we all have that role to play. But I want to ask you kind of where you are right now. You're at the United Nations, doing really important work, and I want to kind of feel into your horizon point. As I often like to say, like for us on our journeys, it's as much where we're starting from as where we envision ourselves going. What's the marker on the horizon to the place we want to be? And I want to kind of ask you that question. as a starting point, but really personalize it for David. Like what is your horizon point, your mission, your dreams that fuel the work that you're saying? I love the directions you're going, but what's the fuel?
I think it's having an impact, and I think there's maybe three threads in me that I try to bring together, and I think the work in climate and sustainability elegantly brings those together. I love to be a teacher, both to be constantly learning and to be sharing that enthusiasm with other people. And so on a one-to-one level, personal level, I think that's really profound. I also like to be a strategist and a planner. So seeing how all of the pieces fit together. That's why being at COP28 was so stimulating, and at past COPs to see how different negotiations fit together and how different systems react to the challenges that climate change is putting on them. And then last, though, I really want to be a change maker. And to me, this is, I think, the unique piece on that horizon point, which is really trying to find the areas in this system that are the most high leverage. I'm the most excited by technologies that are scalable to really do things in a way that are different than how we're presently doing them. Organizations that have the ability to, whether they're regulators, whether they're industry bodies, to change how a large group of people are doing it. We all are so busy. We have so much going on. This is such a big issue and no one can do everything. Mm-hmm. So where are those places in the system where a push, and we'll talk probably about some of the science and about tipping points, but I think about where are the positive tipping points? Where can my leaning my shoulder into it create that change, move the system to a different state? And that system may be as micro as a company, but it can be a bigger one as well. And so I'm constantly on the lookout for those hinge points, whether it's in the financial system, whether it's in the international space. And so to me, that's really guiding. And as I said, what stimulates me on the day-to-day is definitely those personal interactions and the excitement of the planning and the strategizing. But I think what I'm about is really, looking at those positive tipping points and myself trying to be one.
And I love that concept of finding those hinges, those turning points. And it reminds me of Buckminster Fuller, and the trim tab of how we can find that point of leverage that can have the most impact with the least amount of effort, finding those hinges. And you talk about entities and organizations making important impact. Now I want to talk a little bit about the acronyms. Because UN absolutely loves the acronyms, and you've got a few of them under your belt. You have the TNFD and the NZBA, which is the Task Force on Nature-Related Finance Disclosures, and the Net Zero Banking Alliance. Right. For my audience who might be listening today, can you maybe let us know what the heck is a Task Force for Nature-Related Finance Disclosures, and describe to us what is so innovative about this, and why is it so important? Because it is really important. And I want to hear from you what your take is on this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I always say that the most valuable conversations that I can have in transmitting information are the ones where I have to explain the acronyms. We often slip into this speak, and the UN, unfortunately, is probably guilty of this more than almost any other international body, of having so many that it would completely befuddle a outsider. And so the places where we have to speak about these and unpack them are the places where the circle is broadening and transmission is happening. And so I'm excited to do that. And so the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures is kind of the intellectual successor in some ways to an initiative that the G20 had put together called the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD. That work was really about saying, as Sir Nicholas Stern said in his Stern Review in the mid-2000s, climate change is the greatest market failure of history. How do we begin to make markets work better? Because all of the work that we're doing, all of these things, it would be kind of irrelevant if the market worked properly. We would get where we need to go. And so we need to be pushing on that market, changing that market, rethinking things, because if it were simply that invisible hand, then we would get to a solution that was more desirable without all of this extra work. And yet that's clearly not the world we live in. It's eminently obvious. And so the vision here, first with the climate-related financial disclosures, was to say, okay, if we give institutions more knowledge about the risks and opportunities climate change poses, they will begin factoring that into decision making. And it's a very market forward theory. And I don't think it's one that is completely uncontested. I think there's very many points both about the need for policy actors, the need for consumers, the need for others. But the idea was that information really would be the smoother. So we were both managing these risks better, but also allocating capital better. And so that really went from being kind of a niche idea of sustainability reporting to a really mainstream expectation that people would share what their climate related risks were, do analysis on those types of risks. And yet at the same time as we were doing that, I think we recognized that the financial impacts to a company are really not sufficient to fully understand what the overall systemic impacts are. And so one of the challenges was getting that unit of analysis from the institution of how much will you lose if a flood happens? How exposed are you to carbon pricing? To saying as a system as a whole, if everyone acts in the same way, we may not get the same result as just looking at the individuals. And so part of that meant considering other systems. And so with the incredible human dependency on ecosystem services and the natural world, realizing that climate was both an accelerant of nature loss, but also in some cases a consequence of it, realizing that we needed to broaden the umbrella to consider not just climate-related risks, but sustainability and nature-related risks more generally. And at the same time, also recognizing that it isn't enough to draw that line right around the company or organization reporting, and really to begin asking the hard questions about upstream, the suppliers, downstream, the consumers, and the communities and the footprints where these firms are operating. Just because you're sitting on a hill, whether that hill is a metaphorical hill of a financial position or a literal one, your obligations don't end just because the water level fails to rise to flood you. All of those around you are still part of that responsibility, especially when your activities are having impacts on them. And so part of the task force on nature-related financial disclosures was to expand both the scope in terms of what things we cover, but also to expand in terms of how we think about them, who we should be considering when we do this kind of analysis and reporting.
So what are the institutions that are you engage with the task force? And what's sort of the mechanics of this? I mean, this is all important conversation, but like how does it apply in the real world?
Yeah. So both task forces were created with, as it suggests, a number of individuals representing various organizations, both industry organizations as well as NGOs. And they were there to kind of try to write the rules of the game or the guidelines. But much of the work, and this is where I come in more, is really on the implementation side. So working with major financial actors, banks, investors, and insurers to say, okay, here are the recommendations out there. And those recommendations may have specific elements that they need to consider. But ultimately, the challenge, of course, is in the details. And so what does this mean for your organization? And what does it mean for the financial sector overall? How do we begin to first identify where our activities are taking place? Think about strategies that are going to leave us and our clients and our communities resilient under a variety of different potential futures. And how are we going to take the steps and be accountable to ourselves and to those communities to manage the risks we face? And then, of course, with the metrics, how do we actually know that we're making progress? How do we know both what we've committed to, but also that progress is being made? So we look at data on climate and nature. We look at analytical methods. We look at also the more qualitative, the discussions with senior leaders, questions of roles and responsibility, and all of those pieces to say, how do we, to use and paraphrase the quote from former Bank of England chief Mark Carney, how do we make sure that every financial decision considers climate? And I would append to that, considers climate and nature. And I think that that's very much what you were saying as well. It's artificial to say we've put this into a report, so that's our climate risk. This stuff is woven in to your credit risks. This stuff is woven into your profitability. This stuff is woven in to the organizational efficiency that you bring. And so it's not to say we have this much climate risk. It's really to say instead, climate risk is changing the ways in which we are doing business in these ways. So I always try to tell people, this isn't a trend. This isn't a reporting requirement. It really is a change in the operating system. We can't keep doing what we're doing. Sustainability at its heart is about being able to continue doing what you're doing. And in the same way that working 18-hour days is unsustainable, or burning more cash than you have on hand is unsustainable, following practices that are going to presume the infinite on a finite planet are also unsustainable. And so getting back to that root of sustainability, I think, is what all of these frameworks really are about, is trying to both restore that mentality and improve the resiliency, given that even if we stop all of the negative activities today, we still have many consequences that we need to grapple with.
I think that's a really, really important point. And I'm just, you mentioned about progress, like how we're actually measuring this progress. How are we able to hold accountable institutions to progress? And I actually I struggle sometimes, David, honestly, with how we're defining that progress. I mean, I think you and I probably aligned on this in terms of, progress in terms of nature and climate, of course. But when we're talking about impact, and this is something that's become ubiquitous, I find, in the entire space, and particularly in the financial institutions, around the notion of, impact investment or impact measures, right? And we throw this word around so easily, like as if there's nothing but positive impact. But the reality is that impact simply means, an action that has an effect on something else. And you kind of alluded to this, like their impacts can be negative and they can be positive. And the impact of climate change could be, a tipping point that destroys the Amazon bioregion, or the impact of a financial decision can cause smallholder farmers to become destitute. A positive impact can be, pocketbooks of a billionaire, as much as it is on preserving a species near extinction, right? So, I mean, we throw the word impact around, and even there are some times when the equation has a both and. The impact it can be positive on one's pocketbook and negative to biodiversity, or positive, negative. So how do we hold financial institutions accountable for the impact they have on the world at different scales when it's such a complex issue? Like how are we able to understand the risks and the rewards, understand the risks and the opportunities in these equations at local, regional, global scales when it's such a complex system?
Yeah, I think that this is the critical question. And we spend a lot of time in international discussions and negotiations trying to define the rules of the game. But even more importantly than that is to know who is winning the game, who is making progress, and how do we measure that? And with apologies to introduce a new framework, which I'm trying out here. So we'll see if it falls flat, or maybe this will be the unofficial launch of it. I kind of would try to divide notions of impact into three categories. One is simply definitional, and maybe we call that kind of level 0 impact, which is we make a commitment to $100 billion in sustainable finance. And then we look in our portfolio and we say, oh, well, construction is an important part of sustainability, and so is agriculture. So actually, we're already doing 90 billion in sustainable finance. So that is totally non-additional and questionable whether it's actually providing benefit. Then I would say there's the kind of market rate direction of impact, which is you are involved in something that makes perfect financial sense without any alterations to it. I'd call that kind of level 1 impact, which is, yeah, stop investing in coal in the US if it's a money loser. Yes, start investing in solar if that is the cheapest form of energy. Those are kind of no-brainers, and we see you just as a market actor doing that. And that is a real change, but you're not stepping out of line, to use the giraffe analogy. You're not sticking your neck out in that. The part, and this is the part that I'm really excited about, is maybe what I would call kind of level 2 impact, which is the one that we're really seeking. And this is this idea of how do we actually do more than what the market is ready for? Maybe that is offering preferential financing to certain types of activities. Maybe it's supporting, both with business consulting and other things, a way to help our smaller clients grow faster than they otherwise would. What is the direct value add that isn't purely on the market-based capital approach? And so that's what I'm always most interested to kind of poke and probe with companies, to see what impact they're having in that really catalytic way. And obviously that kind of level 1 impact, having a lot of money to throw at the problem, can be good. But in some cases, it doesn't necessarily make you a climate hero, because all you're doing is following something that is already sensible to do. And the goal obviously is not to have people do things that are not sensible, but it's to make that future that we want, rather than simply existing. As the first one is, I think, kind of a past focus, that level 0 is, well, we'll take the old and we'll call it something new. The middle one is, this is where the market is at, and we are part of that process as a market actor. But we're not saving the world by helping the market clear. It's not a bad thing, but it's also just an action that we would take otherwise. And then finally, with that level 2, that is really about the future, bringing that market forward, bringing these things into reality. And I think that those are the points. And that's, I think, where impact investing itself, which Kopp talked a lot about this idea of billions, trillions, millions, we throw these rhyming words around, but impact investors are in the millions. I think a lot of the market rate mechanisms are in the billions, and the total finance is in the trillions. And so, as I was saying about my own journey, finding those points of leverage does kind of mean, how do we direct those millions in the most catalytic way that they unlock the billions? And we begin having those people who have the trillions to hand moving themselves up that system as well to support positive change. But to me, that really is kind of the way I see impact, is we need to be thinking not just in the size terms of how much is this or that, but really in the metrics of, okay, how many gigawatts of installation is this supporting? How many new green jobs is this? How many tons of CO2 equivalent are we removing? These are the pieces that ultimately, the planet is fairly agnostic on who does what, on what country does what, on what company does what. And so as a result, the final tabulation is going to be based on some of these, really kind of getting back to that point about being a bit of a data nerd, really based on these scientific quantities and these scientific metrics, or if we're considering economics, then economic ones. But the other piece is just projects financed or dollar amounts. Those things are going to be just simply, the first order information that will need to be further processed.
Well, David, there's a lot to unpack here. There was a lot in there. And I think we heard it first here on Chad's Climate Quest, David Carlin's new framework for impact finance. But you mentioned 3 levels, and I want to clarify. I heard 2, but I think you said there were 3. Did I miss one?
Yeah. So I would say level 0 is not really impact. It's 0. Simply impact in name only, with the idea that, and so I wouldn't even kind of put it on the impact chain in the sense of, this is simply a reclassification that doesn't actually move the market. It is simply, we could kind of call it, paper impact of, well, now you're the proud owner of a $90 billion portfolio in sustainability, but is it really? And I think that kind of is just simply reclassification, where the other is moving into new activities that the market is already supporting. And then that top one, that level 2, is really, what are the catalytic things that bring that market to you, that actually play the role, not as the passive investor, but really as the active market shifter.
Okay, thank you for that clarification point. I missed the ground 0, but I actually think that makes a tremendous amount of sense, because it's almost, it is that sort of business as usual, like reclassifying things that you're already doing and saying, oh, I'm kind of ticking some boxes, but it's not really any transformation or adopting new ways of business, new ways of doing things, and certainly not catalytic. I like this 3 levels. I think it's good. And so, for those of you listening, let's make sure we remember to remember this, David's new framework. I really love it. I'm waiting to see that paper that you produce on it. We're talking a lot about markets, though, David. I mean, we're talking about markets, and we're part of when we think about business as usual and the systems we're operating is the function of, a lot of the challenge that we're facing on the planet is a function of the way the markets operate, and the ways that markets have been operating for, quite some time. Let's be honest. That's quite some time. And so my question to you is, when we're talking about levels, ground 0, level 1, level 2, is there a level 3 where it's actually thinking beyond the market mechanisms? Like, how do we fundamentally change the market itself? And this is kind of pushing the envelope here, but I mean, this is how do we create a regenerative future? And that's going beyond sustainability. And we talked a lot about climate, a lot about sustainability. How do we push beyond to another level where we're actually redefining the market and maybe, moving away from some of these typical metrics that we think about in the market into something different, like a well-being economy? Where does that fit into the levels?
I really like that. And I do think that is transformative. And I think in some ways it fits a little bit into that top level, but perhaps it even stands outside the activities, because what I've conceptualized here is still a very market-based system, is still a traditional capitalist economy of how do we do these things in that context. I think, as you said at the beginning of this podcast, and it's an exciting opportunity, as these changes are being done, we can get into the source code of a lot of the problems and biases that we see in modern society and try to rewrite them and try to not repeat the same mistakes. And so I think this is kind of the market-based approach. And it doesn't mean that everything is a market positive. As I said, part of that level too is taking on things that aren't necessarily profitable in the near term, aren't necessarily maximizing, but are maximizing for the impact you're having. But I think we can also begin to question what the underpinnings of these systems are and what sort of success metrics we have. As I said, I'm a very strong advocate for, at least on environmental themes, having those success metrics be the countable and the tangible, both bio and geophysical quantities, because those are the things that will have the impact on the planet. We can tomorrow say that our emissions are zero because we've written them off all to corporations or to those overseas, but that won't cool the planet even a fraction of a degree. And so I think staying anchored to that. But the other piece that you brought up that I think is really an important one is, what kind of world do we want as well? Because there's a bit of, let's stop trying to make the world hotter. Let's stop trying to destroy nature. Those are clear things. This idea, as the Secretary General said, if we need a peace treaty with nature, is absolutely true. But we can also say, what kind of world do we want to inhabit? That those are the basic preconditions. At minimum, we need to be getting to a carbon neutral future. At minimum, we need to be nature positive. But what kind of equity do we want across peoples, across opportunities? And those are things that are, I think, very much on the table for exploration. And so we've seen, the last 100 years has seen more people join the planet, as well as more people join democracies than in all of human history. And yet we're at a point where those gains are not just foreordained and not indefinite. And I think that the questions of freedom, the questions of well-being are ones that we need to grapple with simultaneously, because of the effects that they're having on the planet, but also because of the effects that they're having on the people that are making the decisions to impact the planetary systems that we've been talking about.
Well, I mean, this is always a little challenging for me, David. I'm going to push a little bit on this because we often talk, and you hear this all the time from economists, and I'm trained as in economics and political science, and I've heard this constantly, particularly in the last couple decades. This market-based mechanism, the system that we're operating in, has transformed humanity for the better. And look at all of these metrics. Look at, people's are able to live longer, healthier lives than they did. True. That's true. By and large, right? And they have longer life expectancy. They have better, they're able to have more stuff in their lives that we assume is something that they want and something is benefiting them. And they have more disposable income than they would have in the past. And we say this as the more people have this, but if we kind of do the math around the actual numbers, I question the absolute versus relative numbers here. Like relative to how we were in the past, like the relative disparity and inequality, right? The difference, the delta, there's far more people on this planet relatively better off than they would have been previously, proportional wise. But in absolute terms, there's still billions more on the planet that are destitute. More people on the planet right now are experiencing poverty, are experiencing degradation to their environment. They're experiencing what we might say is the opposite of well-being, the opposite of all of these metrics than existed on the planet 200 years ago in absolute terms. So we throw these relative numbers around, to be honest, and say like, oh, well, the numbers show like X percentage of the population is this. But we forget that the absolute numbers are actually, there are billions more people are being adversely affected by this market economy. So I want to throw that out there. And I think this is one of the challenges with the market mechanism, that we like to laud the advances that this fossil fuel based economy and market driven mechanisms have provided for everybody on the planet. And yet I'm not sure we're actually talking about well-being for the majority of actual people on the planet. Relatively increasing compared to 200 years ago, relative. I'm not sure absolute.
It's a really interesting and important point. We're about at the 200th anniversary. I think 1827 actually was the year when the human population surpassed 1 billion. We're now, of course, 8 times that. And even from the mid 1950s and 60s, we've doubled our population. And now, by best estimates, that population is beginning to slow its growth, and estimates for maximum population are looking closer to, say, 10 billion than they are to 12 or higher. But at the same time, the number of people without electricity, so going back to that, right, the number of people without electricity 200 something years ago is about equivalent to what it is today. Obviously, the vast majority of the world has electricity, but for each individual person, those are human beings that are facing deprivation, and many are facing it in ways that are particularly challenging. What I would say is we have made humanity better off, and many human beings, but I think we do need to take that absolute approach in terms of saying, if this isn't working for a large number of people, it's our responsibility to change it. That idea of injustice anywhere affects justice everywhere, to paraphrase Martin Luther King. I think that is a really important point. The market, though, has I think done a tremendous amount for advancing humans and allowing us even to reach the human numbers that we are at today. On the other hand, I think it's worth noting that this has been a little bit of a loan, and a loan in terms of ancient sunlight, in the sense that we're burning the remains of fossilized living matter at rates that I think the latest I heard was it's something on the order of the amount of coal we burn each year is equivalent to about 400 years worth of coal formation. So even if you're not concerned about it running out, and I think the latest science really shows the planet will be well cooked before we run out of every last combustible fossil fuel on the planet. So we need to leave a lot in the ground. But even when you think about this is kind of this promissory note that we've paid to the earth. And now I'm not someone who believes you should never take on a loan. Plenty of people for school, plenty of people to buy a house. There are many important things about borrowing, but there's another critical element, which is we do need to pay it back. And I think that the market has been a great borrowing mechanism. But if we use that as a credit card, we're kind of at that point where we're beginning to reach the max out point, where we're not going to be able to spend more on that card. And so I think we need to think about, I can't pay off one credit card with another. And in some ways, purely market-driven approaches that don't consider those boundaries are a little bit of that, of, okay, well, we can deal with climate by impacting nature, or, oh, we can deal with pollution. And so I do think we need to consider those operating systems. And it's not that we have to go back to the time before we started that borrowing. I think that that's a big misconception, but it's that we need to think about a way to repay and stop the borrowing in a means that will provide, as you're saying, for the flourishing of all people.
I love the credit card analogy. I think it's a good one. And I also feel, talking about tipping points, it's as if we're at the point of maxing out a very high interest credit card that is only going to exacerbate the debt dramatically, right? I love this credit card analogy. I think we're in a space of where we are maxing. We're almost at that point. I think we've actually, frankly, we have maxed out. I mean, if we look at our global footprint, we're well past that point of maxing it out. And what we're actually doing is we have a very high interest credit card that is making it almost impossible. What I worry about is where it's impossible to repay. And the moment these tipping points happen, it's as if you're going into foreclosure or something, or bankruptcy or something like this, and you simply can't repay. And this is my concern in this analogy. And I think you're right, but like, how do we get off of the borrowing? How do we get off of that sort of mentality that this market mechanisms are so good at providing for us, that has sort of created, I think, an illusion of improvement for humanity. And when we talk about people not having access to electricity, 800 million people in the world are starving today. That was, as you pointed out, in 1827. That's 80% of the whole global population in 1827. Right now, I don't want to beleaguer the point here, because I do think what we're doing, what we do need to transform financial institutions. My question really, though, is like, how are we going to do it? How do we catalyze these kinds of shifts in financial institutions in these mechanisms? That can, and how do we create mechanisms, incentives for financial institutions and working in this market system to see real impact? And when I think of impact, I think of plus impact. I think about, we're in this and you touched upon it earlier, and I think it was so totally accurate. And I say this all the time. We don't want 1.5 degree warming. It's just a target that we hope will prevent catastrophic collapse of natural and human systems, right? But it's not like we want that warming. The Sustainable Development Goals are certainly very noble, but it's the barest minimum we want for humanity. And so I think we operate a lot in terms of, impact and how we can, find solutions that have these benefits. But we're also operating on benefits, assuming that it's the minimum case. And you touched upon that earlier. How do we create plus positive impact, almost absolute impact? My vision for that future is 100, like, only benefit. Like, how do we find those solutions that create benefit for nature, for humanity, for every person on this planet, and every species on this planet, and it's just benefit, no trade-offs, no risk? Then that's a super lofty goal, David. I mean, that's lofty.
I mean, it's a big question, right? That's like the overall question. And I think if there's the perfect answer, then I'm yet to see it. But I think there are things we can do to move more toward that world. And on the really individual scale, I think people have a lot more power with regard to financial actions and financial institutions than they may think. And one is thinking about where your money is, any money that you have as savings, any money that you have in retirement accounts. That is your voice. And right now, most people have that voice on silent. And that means that you might have money that you've deposited from your work. Maybe you're working as an environmentalist, and that money might be going to support fossil fuels. It might be going to support things that you don't agree with. So speaking up, because it's the very least that these institutions can do, which is to be the proper custodians of your money. So realizing that individual action really does matter. I've sometimes said that if you had, for any of the most controversial banks, if you had 200 customers go and even do a TikTok of cutting up their cards, that would be a boardroom level conversation, even on a weekend. This kind of thing is something that the perception really does matter. A lot of brands, especially in an industry like finance, where most things are not highly differentiated, how do you choose to work with bank A versus bank B? It's usually relational. And before that, then it's about rates. Those rates may be the same. And so if you know that those things are the same, all else equal, you want to pick the greener bank. Most of the time, we don't speak up and we don't look at that. But those kind of decisions matter. And institutions know it too, because they know the product they're offering isn't so differentiated. So that's why it's really important those human relationships. It's really important what the institution values. So realizing individual power is a big piece here. I think another piece, though, is considering the multiple public and private levers. A lot of conversations the last couple of years have been about rethinking development finance. And we have this kind of 80-year-old edifice called Bretton Woods after the conference in New Hampshire, really at the end of the Second World War, that kind of established the global monetary order with the World Bank, with the International Monetary Fund. And what we need to recognize is for many countries, many people around the world, the solution to their problems is not more debt, is not necessarily creating a system that simply is a money transfer from the poorer nations to the wealthier nations based on resources, but really is one that puts equity first. And so what that means is starting to think of public finance as well as public incentives as ways to engage and activate market actors, as ways to engage and activate communities to do things that are more just, to bring in flows of money. In many cases, these organizations that are on the ground are the ones that actually are the ones that have the best data, the best information. And then finally, I think the last thing is we need to use innovation. I've seen some really exciting things with the use of blockchain to bring direct payments right to a local climate finance project. In some ways, this has its origins even with M-Pesa in Kenya, with a number of people without even bank accounts being able to be paid through their phone, and really recognizing that when we cut out the middlemen, when we make these things more direct, it becomes more accessible and more affordable. Thinking about other innovations that we have now, both technologically and otherwise, I sometimes say finance is all about smoothing. You have something you want now, but you can't afford it, but you're making money. How do you smooth that across the time? Or I'm making money now, but I won't be in the future. How do I smooth that consumption over time so I have the money later? Almost every financial product, whether it's a loan, an annuity, an equity, is one form of that or another. And so almost every problem we have that is a financial problem is one of that lack of smoothing. Are the solar panels too expensive for people in that community to install? Is the payback period too long for that wind farm? Is the cost of getting a project permitted too expensive for it to return money to its investors? All of this, I think, is really about smoothing. And so I tell you, take power, demand change also in the international systems, but also continue to think about the innovations that we have now, which we have more than ever, to begin moving this money to where it needs to be.
Very, very sage advice. Really appreciate you taking the time to elucidate that. I love what you're saying around the connections both of the individual action and the collective. I mean, the institutional change. I often say, we need the bottom up, top down. So yes, we need individual action. We need top down from policymakers, but middle out, transformation from institutions themselves. But where we see ourselves, the individual, whether we're bottom up individuals or top down as regulators and policymakers, are creating simple incentives for those institutions. And a lot of my research actually over my career has been around institutional identity and the connection between individuals and the role they play within institutions for transformation. And I think that's a lot of it too, is like, how do we change the way financial institutions are seeing their own role in this global system, and understanding what those metrics are to evaluate that, and learn from that, and how these identities can change over time from connecting the individual to the collective. David, we are a little past our time, so thank you very much for staying on with us. I do have one question that I ask all of my guests, and I know actually we could probably go on for another hour, just like our last conversation, to be honest. So, but we'll have to save that for a second episode of the podcast. But before we sign off, here, this final question, ask every one of my guests, in the short time that we have. I know it's a big one, but what is your vision for a regenerative future? What's your vision? What's the marker on the horizon that paint us that picture? And what's your role in achieving it?
Wow, that's a big question. It's I would say it's more than the elephant in the room. Maybe it's the woolly mammoth in the room, but or the blue whale in the room. But I would really say that, getting back to that use of language, and you said at the beginning we're language nerds. Well, I think yes, that sustainability in its its heart is about keeping this human game going and improving and not blowing that opportunity for so many of the exciting things that the future could hold by doing things that we know we can't keep doing indefinitely. And so to me, sustainability is getting back to that bedrock of we can keep doing things the way we're doing them because it is sustainable. And right now, we're certainly not in that place. So really getting back to that. And that means looking at the planetary boundaries on elements of nature and the physical environment. I think it also means really trying to rewire things and start with people and planet first, and recognizing that finance and profit are vehicles for achieving those aims, but are not aims in and of themselves. And I think that what would look like success to me would be where we have both a lot more global harmony and work as a overall planetary civilization rather than as countries or simply as individuals, but really recognizing that we are in this together. It's really always to me, and on another level of nerddom, looking at space, and I love thinking about that, but seeing some of the pictures from some of the initial Apollo missions, and you see just how unbelievably alone this planet is in space and how inhospitable everywhere else is, whether Mars, whether one of the moons of Jupiter, whether somewhere outside our solar system. And it doesn't mean we won't get there, but this really is home. And just like you would with your family, just like you would with your roommates, this is a home where we all need to get along. It's a home where we all need to preserve it. And beginning to think about that, treating it like a house. One of my favorite little connections is the words economy, ecology. That eco point comes from the ancient Greek word meaning house or household. And I think we need to start thinking in a planetary way about that planetary household, because then we will make the decisions that support sustainability. We don't spend more than we have to pay our rent, because otherwise we're going to lose the property we have. We don't allow the dishes to pile up until there's nothing to eat off, because we know that we're going to need those. And so thinking about that means kind of like what I was saying on the financial actions, having a bit of ownership for this, but also a recognition that all of us are part of that solution too. So I think seeing more of that awareness, that consciousness is a big part of it. But really, as I said, bringing it back to that notion that this is our home and there's no other neighbors on the street. So we really need to get this right.
I love that that point around, eco being, this the ancient Greek derived as from home. I really love that. And also family. I think this is part of that connection of our home. Our house is the one planet we have. This idea of finding planet B, it's kind of ludicrous. But also seeing how we're all part of one family. And also our fellows life forms on this planet as well, and how we interact. So thank you for that really beautiful vision, David, and for this wonderful conversation, and for joining me on my climate quest. We've learned a tremendous amount from your story. It's been inspiring, informative, exciting, and there's, again, so much more that we could be talking about. And I'm going to save that for the next episode. But I'm sure all of our listeners, like me, are excited to be taking a little bit of this energy, taking part in this conversation, taking a little of this energy with us throughout this year. So I'd like to thank you, David, for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Chad. No, it's great to be here, and really eager to hear more of the conversations that you're having across the space.
And thank you all for joining us today. I'm thrilled to welcome you on my climate quest. This podcast is brought to you by Regen Intel, a public benefit advisory and education platform training the next generation of leadership for a better planet, and co-produced and distributed by our incredible partners, Better Worlds, Source Studios, and Shikonomy. Special thanks to Michael Katijian, aka Inverse K, for the incredible intro number for Season 3 of this podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others. And to learn more about Regen Intel, check out our Foundations program at www.regenintel.earth/education. Applications are accepted all year round. See you next time on Chad's Climate Quest.